a tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight when Lyra Nightingale finally accepted that she was going to die in these mountains, and honestly, there was a certain bitter poetry to it that she couldn't help but appreciate, even as her fingers went numb and her silver hair became so matted with ice that it hung like frozen chains down her back. She had been walking through the hostile northern territories for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it had only been about 72 hours since she'd crossed into what the maps called the disputed lands. Those vast stretches of wilderness that belonged to no pack and therefore belonged to everyone, which meant they were the most dangerous places a lone wolf could possibly traverse, because rogues and outcasts and things far worse than either prowled these forests looking for easy prey. Lyra supposed she qualified as easy prey now, with her thin, traveling cloak that had been meant for autumn weather, and was doing absolutely nothing against the winter storm that had descended from the mountains like the wrath of the moon goddess herself, with her meager supplies that had run out yesterday morning, and with her body that was shutting down slowly but surely from hypothermia and exhaustion and the bone-deep weariness that came from 6 months of running from a past that refused to stay buried no matter how far she walked. Her mother used to tell her that silver hair was a blessing from the goddess, a mark of someone destined for greatness and magic, and a life that would be remembered in songs and stories for generations to come. But Lyra's mother had been dead for 5 years now, and all her silver hair had brought her was suspicion and fear and ultimately banishment from the only home she'd ever known. The Silver Moon Pack had cast her out 6 months ago, right after the incident that Lyra still couldn't think about, without her chest constricting so tightly she could barely breathe. Right after Theron had collapsed during their mating ceremony, with blood pouring from his nose and mouth, while the entire pack watched in horror. Right after the healers had pronounced him dead from what they claimed was a heart attack, but what everyone knew in their bones was something far more sinister and unnatural. They had blamed her voice, of course, because Lyra had been singing the traditional bonding song when Theron fell, had been pouring every ounce of her heart and soul, and the magical gift she'd inherited from her mother into the melody that was supposed to seal their bond and bring them joy and prosperity and a lifetime of happiness together. But instead, her voice had apparently become a weapon that stopped his heart and stole his life, and marked her as something cursed and dangerous and unwanted. The pack alpha had given her a choice, which was more mercy than some would have shown under the circumstances, and that choice had been simple and brutal in its clarity. Leave voluntarily and never return. Never sing again. Never use the gift that had defined her entire existence. Or stay and face execution as a threat to pack safety and a murderer of one of their own. Lyra had chosen exile, had walked out of Silver Moon territory with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bag of supplies that the pack had grudgingly provided, because even in their fear and anger, they couldn't quite bring themselves to send her out to die with absolutely nothing, and she had been wandering ever since, moving from territory to territory and never staying long enough to form attachments or raise suspicions, or give anyone a reason to ask too many questions about why a young Omega with silver hair and violet gray eyes was traveling alone without pack protection or family ties or any of the things that made a wolf safe in this brutal world. She hadn't sung a single note in 6 months, hadn't even hummed to herself when she was alone in the wilderness at night, because the memory of Theron's body hitting the ground and the sound of the pack's collective gasp of horror, and the way everyone had looked at her with such fear and revulsion was burned into her mind so deeply that she couldn't separate her voice from the image of death and destruction, and everything she'd tried so hard not to become. Her mother's gift had been beautiful and pure and healing, had been the kind of magic that brought comfort to the sick, and peace to the dying, and joy to celebrations and gatherings. But somehow, when that gift passed to Lyra, it had become twisted and corrupted and deadly. Or at least that's what she told herself in the darkest hours of the night, when the guilt became so overwhelming that she could barely stand to exist inside her own skin. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees with a sound that was almost alive in its fury, and Lyra stumbled over a root hidden beneath the snow and went down hard on her hands and knees, the impact jarring through her frozen joints and sending a spike of pain up her arms that she barely registered, because everything hurt now and had been hurting for so long that pain had become just another constant companion on this journey to nowhere. She stayed there on the ground for a long moment, her breath coming in short gasps that created little clouds of vapor in the freezing air, her silver hair hanging around her face like a curtain that blocked out the world, and she seriously considered just staying down, just letting the snow cover her and the cold take her, and the whole miserable existence she'd been enduring finally come to its inevitable end. It would be easy, she thought with a detachment that probably should have frightened her, but instead just felt like resignation, to simply stop fighting and let nature take its course and become just another frozen corpse that some hunter might find in the spring when the snow melted and the forest came back to life. Though by then, there would be nothing left of her but bones, and perhaps a few scraps of cloth, and certainly no indication of who she'd been, or what she'd lost, or why she'd been alone in these mountains when the winter came for her. But then, she heard it, cutting through the storm and the wind and her own spiraling thoughts with a clarity that made her lift her head despite the exhaustion that weighed down every muscle in her body. And what she heard was the unmistakable sound of combat, of metal clashing against metal, and snarls that were definitely wolf, and screams that were definitely human, or at least humanoid, and the sounds were coming from somewhere ahead of her, through the trees where the forest opened up into what her frozen mind vaguely remembered being a small valley. Every survival instinct that Lyra possessed, every lesson her mother and father had drilled into her about staying alive in hostile territory, every ounce of common sense that she'd accumulated over her 24 years of existence, was screaming at her to turn around and go the other direction, to put as much distance between herself and whatever violence was happening in that valley as her failing body could manage, because wolves who fought in blizzards were either desperate or dangerous, or both, and none of those options ended well for a lone Omega who could barely stand upright. But Lyra had always been cursed with a healer's heart, had inherited not just her mother's magical voice, but also her mother's absolute inability to walk away from suffering and pain and creatures in need, even when walking away was clearly the smart and sensible and self-preserving thing to do. And so instead of running, she found herself stumbling forward through the snow and the wind toward the sounds of battle, her numb fingers clutching at tree trunks for support as she forced her frozen legs to keep moving one step at a time. The sounds grew louder as she got closer, and she could now distinguish individual voices among the chaos, could hear someone shouting orders in a language that sounded like Old Norse, mixed with something more guttural and primal, could hear the wet sounds of blades finding flesh, and the howls of wolves in pain, and the kind of desperate fighting that spoke of warriors who knew they were losing but refused to give up anyway. Lyra reached the edge of the tree line and stopped, her breath catching in her throat at the scene that unfolded before her in the valley below. And what she saw was carnage on a scale that made her stomach turn and her healer's instincts roar to life, despite her exhaustion and fear and the very real knowledge that she was looking at her own death if she made the wrong choice in the next few seconds. There were bodies everywhere, scattered across the blood-stained snow like broken dolls, some in human form and some in wolf form, and all of them clearly dead or dying. And the warriors who were still standing were engaged in brutal close quarters combat with what had to be at least 40 rogues who had the crazed look and erratic movements of wolves who'd been exiled so long they'd forgotten what it meant to be part of a pack. The warriors were clearly elite soldiers. Even Lyra's untrained eye could see that in the way they moved and fought and protected each other's backs despite being hopelessly outnumbered. And they wore matching leather and fur armor with an insignia that made her blood run cold because she recognized it from stories and warnings and the kind of pack legends that traveling wolves whispered about in taverns and safe houses. These were Viking warriors, members of the legendary Northern Guard that served the Winter King himself, and they were dying in this frozen valley, far from their home territory, while she watched from the shadows like a coward who couldn't decide whether her own survival was worth more than the lives of warriors who would probably kill her on sight if they knew she was a packless rogue trespassing in lands they claimed as their own. The battle was winding down now, not because the Vikings were winning, but because they were simply running out of warriors to fight, and Lyra counted 8 men still on their feet, though all of them were clearly wounded and exhausted and barely holding their weapons. And then she saw him, and everything else in the world seemed to fade into insignificance compared to the sight of the warrior who stood at the center of the remaining Vikings, like a pillar of strength and defiance, even as blood poured from a dozen wounds across his body. He was massive, even by Viking standards, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of kingdoms, and his hair was silver white and hung loose past his shoulders in a way that should have looked disheveled, but instead looked wild and magnificent and almost otherworldly in the dim light filtering through the storm clouds. And when he turned his head to shout something to his men, Lyra saw his profile and felt something slam into her chest with enough force to make her gasp. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes and the kind of masculine beauty that came from strength and power and absolute confidence in one's place in the world, with a strong jaw that was currently clenched in determination and high cheekbones that spoke of noble bloodlines and ice-blue eyes that even from this distance seemed to glow with an inner light that was definitely not natural and definitely not human. And there was something about him that called to every instinct Lyra possessed, even though she didn't know his name or his rank or anything about him, except that he was clearly the alpha of this group, and he was dying along with his men while she stood here debating whether her cursed voice was worth the risk. The rogues suddenly pulled back, retreating into the forest with a coordination that suggested they weren't actually mindless exiles, but rather soldiers following orders, and Lyra realized with growing horror that they were leaving to get reinforcements and would be back soon to finish what they'd started, which meant these 8 warriors had maybe an hour before they were overwhelmed and killed. The silver-haired warrior seemed to realize this too, because he barked out orders that sent his men into defensive positions, and then he did something that made Lyra's decision for her in a way that nothing else could have, because he looked directly at where she was hiding in the tree line with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through the snow and the shadows and every wall she'd built around her broken heart. And he didn't shout a warning or raise his weapon or show any of the aggression she would have expected from an alpha who'd just spotted a stranger watching his warriors die. Instead, he simply held her gaze with an intensity that made her feel like he was looking into her very soul. And then he nodded once, as if giving her permission for something she hadn't even asked for yet, And Lyra found herself stepping out of the tree line and walking down into that valley of blood and death with her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat and her mind screaming that this was suicide. But her healer's heart, knowing with absolute certainty that she couldn't walk away from this, couldn't let these warriors die when she had the power to save them, even if that power might kill them just as surely as the rogues would. And as she approached the silver-haired alpha who watched her with those impossible eyes, she made a choice that would change everything. Made a decision to break the silence she'd maintained for 6 months and use the voice she'd sworn never to use again. And she opened her mouth and began to sing. The first note that escaped Lyra's lips was cracked and rusty from 6 months of disuse, trembling with fear and uncertainty and the very real terror that this might be the moment when her curse revealed itself again, and she watched these 8 warriors die the same way Theron had died, with blood pouring from their mouths and noses, while their hearts simply stopped beating because her voice had become a weapon she couldn't control. But the silver-haired alpha was still watching her with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to pierce straight through every defense she'd ever constructed. And there was something in his gaze that wasn't fear or suspicion or the wariness she'd grown accustomed to seeing in every wolf who'd looked at her since the incident. Instead, there was something that looked almost like recognition, as if he'd been waiting for her to appear in this valley of blood and snow. As if her presence here was not a surprise, but rather a confirmation of something he'd already known was coming. And that look gave her just enough courage to push past the fear and let the song flow out of her in a way it hadn't flowed since before everything went wrong. The melody that emerged was one her mother had taught her when Lyra was barely old enough to understand the words. An ancient healing song that had been passed down through generations of their bloodline, sung in a language that predated the packs and territories and all the structures that modern wolves had built to organize their existence. And as the words spilled out of her, they carried with them not just sound, but something more tangible and visible, a silver light that seemed to emanate from her throat and flow outward like ribbons of pure magic that danced through the falling snow and wound their way toward the wounded warriors who stood frozen in place, watching her with expressions that ranged from shock to awe, to something that might have been hope. The light reached the nearest warrior first, a broad-shouldered man with a nasty gash across his chest that was bleeding so profusely it had soaked through his leather armor and was dripping onto the snow in steady streams that spoke of severed arteries and imminent death. And when the silver ribbons of her song touched his wound, Lyra saw the flesh begin to knit itself back together, watched as muscle and skin reformed and sealed, and became whole again in a way that should have been impossible but was happening right before her eyes, because this was what her gift was supposed to do. This was the purpose her mother had trained her for. This was healing in its purest and most powerful form. She moved through the warriors methodically, her song never faltering, even as her voice grew stronger and clearer and more confident with each passing moment. And she poured everything she had into the melody because these men were dying and she had the power to save them. And for the first time in 6 months, she felt like maybe, just maybe, her gift wasn't a curse after all, but rather exactly what her mother had always told her it was. A blessing that could bring life and hope and healing to those who needed it most. The second warrior had a broken leg that had been twisted at an angle that made Lyra's stomach turn. The bone clearly shattered in multiple places, but as her song washed over him, she watched the leg straighten and the bones shift and resettle and fuse back together until he was able to put weight on it again without collapsing. The third warrior had taken an arrow through his shoulder, the shaft still embedded in the muscle and sinew, and Lyra's song seemed to loosen the projectile until it fell out on its own, and the wound closed behind it, leaving only smooth skin where moments before there had been an injury that would have taken weeks to heal naturally, if it healed at all. She worked her way through 5 more warriors, healing gashes and broken bones and internal injuries that she could sense with the magical awareness that came with her gift. The ability to feel where life was ebbing away and where death was creeping in, and where her power needed to flow to push back the darkness and restore what had been damaged. By the time she reached the silver-haired Alpha, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, her very life force being drained by the sustained use of magic that her mother had always warned her came with a price. But she couldn't stop now, because he was the most badly wounded of all of them, with deep claw marks across his chest that had narrowly missed his heart, a gash along his ribs that was bleeding heavily, and what looked like the beginnings of hypothermia setting in because he'd clearly been fighting in this blizzard for hours without adequate protection. Lyra knelt beside him in the blood-stained snow, close enough now that she could see the intricate Norse runes tattooed across his arms and chest, close enough to smell the scent of pine and winter storms, and something uniquely him that made her wolf stir for the first time in months, and she let her song wash over him with a gentleness she hadn't shown the others, because there was something about this warrior that called to her in ways she didn't understand and couldn't explain, and definitely shouldn't be feeling when she was a packless rogue who would probably be executed once he regained his strength and remembered that she was trespassing in his territory. His wounds began to close under the influence of her magic, the flesh knitting together and the bleeding stopping and the color returning to his face as his body temperature normalized and his breathing steadied. And Lyra felt a surge of relief so intense it was almost painful because he was going to live. They were all going to live. And for once, her voice had done exactly what it was supposed to do without any unexpected consequences or horrifying side effects. But the relief was short-lived because she suddenly realized with growing alarm that she'd given too much, had poured so much of her life force into healing these warriors that she'd drained herself past the point of safety, past the warnings her mother had drilled into her about never using more magic than her body could sustain. And she could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision, could feel her heart rate slowing and her breathing becoming shallow, and her body starting to shut down, because healing magic always demanded a price, and she'd just paid it with interest. The song died in her throat as she pitched forward, her hands barely catching herself before she face-planted into the snow, and she heard shouting in that Norse-inflected language she didn't understand, heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow toward her, felt strong hands catching her before she could collapse completely. The silver-haired Alpha was saying something, his deep voice urgent and commanding. But Lyra couldn't make out the words because her hearing was fading along with everything else, the world becoming distant and muffled and increasingly irrelevant as her body gave up the fight to stay conscious. She tried to tell him about the rogues coming back, tried to warn him that they needed to move and find shelter and prepare for another attack. But her mouth wouldn't form the words, and her voice was gone again, stolen by the exhaustion that came from giving everything she had to save strangers who probably didn't even want to be saved by someone like her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her completely was the Alpha's face hovering above hers, his ice-blue eyes filled with something that looked like concern and wonder and a fierce protectiveness that made no sense given that he didn't know her and had no reason to care whether she lived or died. And then his hand was touching her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone so large and dangerous, his calloused fingers brushing her silver hair back from her forehead, and she heard him say something in a voice so rough with emotion that it cut through the fog consuming her mind. Words in his native language that she didn't understand, but that somehow conveyed gratitude and respect, and something else she couldn't quite identify. And then there was nothing but darkness, and the distant awareness that she was being lifted and carried. Her body cradled against a broad chest that radiated warmth and safety, and even in her unconscious state, some part of her recognized that she should be afraid, should be fighting against this, should be maintaining the walls and distances that had kept her alive for 6 months. But instead, she felt herself relaxing into the hold, surrendering to the exhaustion and the comfort of being held by someone strong enough to carry her weight without strain. Time became meaningless in the darkness, stretching and contracting in ways that made no sense, and Lyra drifted through periods of semi-consciousness where she was aware of movement and voices, and the sensation of being warm for the first time in days, wrapped in furs and blankets that smelled of smoke and pine, and the same scent she'd detected on the silver-haired Alpha. She heard conversations happening around her in that Norse language, heard the deep rumble of the Alpha's voice giving orders and the responses of his warriors who sounded healthy and whole and alive thanks to the magic she'd given them. And every time she tried to surface completely into wakefulness, something would pull her back down into the darkness. Some combination of exhaustion and magical depletion, and her body's desperate attempt to recover from what she'd done to it. When she finally woke, completely, truly, and fully conscious. For the first time since collapsing in the snow, Lyra found herself in a bed that was far too comfortable and luxurious to be anything she'd experienced in the past 6 months of rough living and sleeping on the ground and making do with whatever shelter she could find. The mattress beneath her was soft and supportive, stuffed with what felt like down feathers, and she was covered in layers of fur blankets that were keeping her so warm she was almost sweating, and the room around her was constructed of heavy timber logs that spoke of permanent settlement rather than temporary camp, with a large stone fireplace crackling cheerfully against one wall and tapestries hanging from the ceiling that depicted wolves and battles and scenes from what she assumed was Viking mythology. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as a wave of dizziness washed over her and made the room spin, her body protesting the movement with aches and pains that seemed to radiate from every muscle and joint, and she fell back against the pillows with a groan that came out louder than she'd intended. The sound must have alerted someone, because within seconds the door to the room swung open and an elderly woman entered, her white hair braided in intricate patterns that reminded Lyra of the designs she'd seen in the tapestries, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and assessing in a way that suggested she missed absolutely nothing. The woman said something in Norse, her tone gentle but firm, and when Lyra just stared at her blankly, the woman switched to the common language with an accent that was thick but understandable, asking her how she was feeling and whether she was in pain and whether she needed water or food or anything else to help with her recovery. Lyra's throat was so dry she could barely speak, but she managed to croak out a request for water. And the elderly woman poured her a cup from a pitcher on the bedside table and helped her drink it slowly, warning her not to gulp it down too fast, or she'd make herself sick. The water helped clear some of the fog from Lyra's mind, enough that she could start asking the questions that were piling up in her head, starting with where she was and how long she'd been unconscious, and whether the warriors she'd healed were all right, and whether she was a prisoner or a guest, or something else entirely. The elderly woman introduced herself as Astrid, explained that Lyra was in the royal settlement of the northern Viking territory, told her she'd been unconscious for 3 full days while her body recovered from the massive magical expenditure, and confirmed that all 8 warriors were alive and healthy and extremely grateful for what she'd done. When Lyra asked about her status, whether she was free to leave or whether she was being held for trespassing, Astrid's expression became unreadable, and she said something that made Lyra's heart start pounding, with a mixture of fear and confusion, explaining that the king himself had ordered that she receive the best care available, and that she was to be treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. And when she was strong enough to stand and walk, he wished to speak with her personally about what had happened in the valley and what her presence in his territory meant. The realization hit Lyra like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her head spin with implications she wasn't ready to process, because if the king wanted to speak with her personally, that meant the silver-haired alpha she'd healed, the warrior whose life she'd saved along with his men, the man who'd carried her to safety and ensured she received care. That warrior was not just some member of the elite guard or a high-ranking soldier. He was the Winter King himself, the most powerful alpha in the entire Northern Territories, the legendary ruler who was said to be as ruthless as he was strategic, as dangerous as he was fair. She had saved the life of a king without knowing it, had used her cursed voice to heal someone so important that his death would have destabilized the entire region. And now she was lying in what was probably a royal guest room, waiting to find out whether her reward for that service would be gratitude or execution or something in between. Because kings didn't take kindly to packless rogues wandering their territories, even when those rogues happened to save their lives. Astrid seemed to sense her growing panic because the old woman reached out and placed a weathered hand on Lyra's arm, her touch surprisingly comforting despite being from a complete stranger. And she told her in a voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty that the king was not going to harm her, that he understood the gift she possessed and the sacrifice she'd made, that he valued courage and honor above all things, and she had demonstrated both in abundance when she chose to help his warriors rather than flee to safety. But there was something else in Astrid's eyes, something that looked almost like knowing amusement, as if the old woman could see threads of fate and destiny that were invisible to everyone else. And she added in a voice barely above a whisper that Lyra's arrival had been prophesied, that the king had been dreaming of a silver-haired woman for 2 years without understanding what those dreams meant. And now that she was here in his territory, everything was about to change in ways none of them could fully predict. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities that Lyra wasn't ready to examine, and before she could ask what Astrid meant by prophecies and dreams and fate, before she could demand more information about this king who apparently dreamed of women he'd never met, the door opened again, and a presence filled the room that made every hair on Lyra's body stand at attention, made her wolf consciousness surge to the surface for the first time in months, made her heart start racing with a combination of fear and anticipation, and something else she absolutely could not name. The silver-haired alpha, the Winter King himself, stood in the doorway with his ice-blue eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And when he spoke, his voice was that same deep rumble she remembered from the valley, rough and commanding and carrying an authority that made it clear he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. And what he said made Lyra's world tilt on its axis because the words that came out of his mouth were not what she'd expected. Not a demand for explanations or accusations of trespassing or questions about her pack status and her reasons for being in his territory. Instead, he said something that simultaneously terrified her and gave her the first real hope she'd felt in 6 months. He looked at her with those impossible eyes and said in a voice that resonated through her entire being, "I know what you are, little songbird, and I know what you fear. But you need to understand something before we go any further. Your voice didn't kill your betrothed because of a curse or because you're dangerous or because there's something wrong with your gift. He died because he wasn't your mate, and your power knew it, recognized the wrongness of that bond, and rejected it before it could form. And I can prove it to you if you'll trust me enough to sing again." The king's words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, heavy with implications that Lyra's exhausted and overwhelmed mind was struggling to process, because what he was suggesting went against everything she'd believed about herself for the past 6 months. Every piece of guilt and self-loathing and fear that she'd carried with her through territories and wilderness and the long, lonely nights when she'd wondered if the world would be better off without her cursed existence in it. She stared at him from her position, propped up against the pillows, her silver hair falling around her shoulders in tangled waves that she was suddenly very conscious of, her violet gray eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope, and the kind of fragile possibility that came from hearing someone offer you salvation when you'd already accepted damnation as your only option. And she wanted to believe him with an intensity that physically hurt. Wanted to accept that maybe Theron's death hadn't been her fault after all. But 6 months of conditioning herself to believe she was dangerous and cursed and fundamentally broken was not something that could be undone with a single statement, no matter how authoritatively it was delivered. King Eric Frostborn, because Astrid had quietly whispered his name before slipping out of the room to give them privacy, moved further into the chamber with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of his size, his silver-white hair catching the firelight and making him look like something out of the old legends her mother used to tell her about warriors blessed by the gods. And he settled himself into a chair beside her bed without asking permission, because kings didn't need to ask permission for anything in their own territory. He studied her face for a long moment, those ice-blue eyes taking in every detail of her expression with an attention that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen in a way she'd never experienced before. And then he began to speak in that deep voice that seemed to resonate through her bones, telling her a story about his mother, who had been a Velva, a seer gifted with prophetic visions, and how before she died, she'd told him that his mate would be marked by silver and would save his life with a song that others would call a death song. But that would actually be the truest expression of the goddess's will. He explained, his words flowing with the kind of patient detail that suggested he understood how hard this was for her to hear and was determined to give her every piece of information she needed to make sense of what had happened. That powerful healing gifts like hers didn't just mend physical wounds or cure illnesses. They recognized truth on a fundamental level that went beyond conscious understanding. They could sense when something was wrong or misaligned or contrary to the natural order of things, and a mating bond between non-mates was exactly the kind of wrongness that such a gift would instinctively reject. Theron hadn't died because Lyra's voice was cursed. Eric insisted with a certainty that left no room for argument. He'd died because forcing a bond that the goddess hadn't intended was an abomination that her power had recognized and corrected, perhaps more violently than necessary, but ultimately in service of protecting her from a false connection that would have caused both of them nothing but suffering and pain. Lyra felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying. 6 months' worth of grief and guilt and self-hatred pouring out of her in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. And Eric reached out without hesitation to pull her against his chest, his strong arms wrapping around her trembling form and holding her with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his warrior's appearance and his king's authority. He let her cry into his furs and leather, one large hand stroking her silver hair with a tenderness that suggested he'd done this before, or perhaps that he simply understood what it meant to carry unbearable weight and finally have someone offer to help shoulder the burden. And he murmured to her in a mixture of Norse and common language, telling her she was safe now, telling her she was valued, telling her that her gift was precious and powerful and exactly what it was meant to be. When the storm of emotion finally passed, and Lyra was left feeling wrung out but somehow lighter than she'd felt in months, Eric pulled back just enough to look at her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the tears that still clung to her cheeks. And he asked her if she would be willing to try something, if she would trust him enough to test the theory he'd presented and prove once and for all that her voice was not a weapon, but rather a gift that needed to be understood and properly directed. Lyra's first instinct was to refuse, to protect this tiny kernel of hope he'd planted in her chest by never putting it to the test and risking having it crushed if he was wrong. But looking into those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense and wall and barrier she'd ever constructed, she found herself nodding agreement even though her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Eric explained what he wanted her to do, and it was both simpler and more terrifying than anything she could have imagined, because he wanted her to sing for him, to use her gift on him the same way she'd used it in the valley when she'd healed his warriors. But this time with full knowledge of who he was and what it might mean if her power truly was cursed and dangerous. He told her about the dreams he'd been having for 2 years, visions of a woman with silver hair whose face he could never quite see clearly, but whose voice he could hear singing songs that made his soul ache with recognition and longing. Dreams that his mother had interpreted before her death as prophecies of his true mate, the one the goddess had chosen for him before he was even born, and he believed with absolute conviction that Lyra was that woman, that her appearance in the valley during the battle had not been chance or coincidence, but rather fate, finally bringing them together the way it had always intended. The mate bond, he explained in response to the question she was too afraid to ask aloud, didn't always snap into place immediately upon meeting. Sometimes it required certain conditions to be met, or barriers to be broken down, or walls to be dismantled before the connection could form. And he suspected that Lyra's fear and guilt and self-imposed silence had been blocking the bond from manifesting, even though her wolf had recognized him on some instinctive level when she'd first seen him in the valley. If she would sing for him now, without the fear and urgency of battle, without the walls she'd built around her gift, without the belief that her voice was deadly, then perhaps the bond would finally complete, and they would both know beyond any doubt that they were meant to be together, that the goddess had been guiding them toward this moment for their entire lives, that everything that had happened, including Theron's death and her banishment and the blizzard that had brought her to his territory, had all been necessary steps on the path to this exact point in time. Lyra took a shaking breath, her mind spinning with the enormity of what he was suggesting. Because if he was right, then everything she'd believed about herself was wrong, and she'd spent 6 months punishing herself for something that wasn't her fault. But if he was wrong, then she was about to kill a king and prove once and for all that she was exactly as dangerous and cursed as her former pack had claimed. Eric seemed to sense her hesitation because he took both of her hands in his much larger ones his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that was both grounding and intimate. And he told her in a voice that carried absolute conviction that he was not afraid, that he trusted her and her gift and the goddess who had brought them together, that he would rather die proving she was worthy of love and acceptance than live knowing he'd let fear prevent them from discovering the truth. The decision made itself in that moment, crystallizing with a clarity that cut through all her doubts and fears and self-recriminations, because Lyra realized that she could spend the rest of her life running from her gift and living in fear of what it might do. Or she could choose to trust this warrior king who looked at her like she was something precious and rare rather than cursed and dangerous. And for the first time in 6 months, she chose courage over fear, hope over despair, possibility over certainty. She opened her mouth and began to sing, not one of the formal healing songs her mother had taught her, but rather a melody that seemed to pour directly from her heart. A song she'd never heard before, but that felt like it had been living inside her, waiting for exactly this moment to emerge. And the words that came out were in that ancient language that predated pacts and territories. Words about finding home after endless wandering, about 2 souls recognizing each other across time and distance, about silver meeting silver and ice meeting fire, and all the pieces of a cosmic puzzle finally clicking into place. The magic that flowed from her this time was different from anything she'd experienced before. Not the focused healing power she'd used on the warriors in the valley, but rather something more fundamental and primal and deeply right. And as the silver light emerged from her throat and danced through the air toward Eric, she saw his eyes widen with wonder and recognition, saw him lean into the magic rather than away from it, saw him opening himself completely to whatever her gift wanted to do. The light wrapped around him like a lover's embrace, sinking into his skin and making the Norse runes tattooed across his body glow with a blue-white radiance that matched his eyes. And Lyra felt something snap into place between them with such force that she gasped, the mate bond forming with an intensity that was almost painful in its perfection. And suddenly, she could feel everything he was feeling. The overwhelming relief and joy and possessive satisfaction of finally finding what he'd been searching for. The absolute certainty that she was his and he was hers, and nothing in this world or any other would ever separate them. Eric surged forward and captured her mouth in a kiss that stole what little breath she had left, his hands coming up to frame her face with a reverence that made her feel like something sacred and cherished. And Lyra kissed him back with 6 months' worth of loneliness and grief and desperate need for connection pouring out of her into him, her fingers tangling in his silver-white hair and pulling him closer even though there was no space left between them. The mate bond flared brighter with every touch and kiss and breathless moment, confirming what they both already knew but needed to feel with absolute certainty, that they were meant for each other in a way that transcended choice or logic or anything resembling rational thought, that the goddess had been weaving their paths together since before they were born, and that every moment of suffering and struggle and pain they'd both endured had been necessary to shape them into the people who could stand beside each other as equals and partners and mates. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and glowing with the energy of the newly formed bond, Eric rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice rough with emotion, telling her that she would never be alone again, never be unwanted or feared or forced to hide the magnificent gift the goddess had given her, that she was his mate and his queen, and he would spend the rest of his life proving to her that she was worthy of love and acceptance, and every good thing the world had to offer. Lyra found herself laughing through her tears, the sound rusty and unpracticed, but genuine for the first time in months, and she told him that she'd walked into a blizzard expecting to die alone and unloved, but instead she'd found him, found a home, found a purpose, found everything she'd stopped believing she deserved, and she would spend the rest of her life singing for him and his pack and anyone else who needed the healing and hope and magic that her voice could provide. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of integration into Viking culture and preparation for the formal mating ceremony that would bind them together before the pack and the goddess. And Lyra discovered that being Eric's mate meant being treated not as property or a prize, but as an equal partner whose opinions and insights were valued in council meetings and strategic planning sessions. She learned that her gift was even more powerful than she'd realized, capable of not just healing physical wounds, but also soothing emotional trauma and breaking curses, and even, as she discovered during a skirmish with rogues, rendering enemies unconscious without harming them permanently. And with Eric's patient guidance and absolute faith in her abilities, she began to understand that her voice was exactly what her mother had always told her it was: a blessing rather than a curse, a tool for bringing peace and healing to a world that desperately needed both. The mating ceremony under the full moon was everything Lyra had never dared to dream about, with the entire pack gathering to witness their union and celebrate the arrival of their new queen. And when Eric marked her before the assembled witnesses, and the mate bond completed with a flash of silver light that illuminated the entire valley, Lyra sang a song of joy and gratitude and belonging that made every wolf present howl in celebration, her voice finally free from fear and full of the power and purpose it had always been meant to carry. Years later, when young wolves came to her feeling cursed by gifts they didn't understand or appearances that made them different, she would tell them her story about walking into a blizzard expecting death, but finding life instead, about a voice she'd believed was cursed but was actually blessed, about a king who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And she would tell them with absolute conviction that the goddess never makes mistakes, that every gift has a purpose, even when we can't see it yet, that being different isn't a curse, but rather a sign that we're meant for something greater than ordinary, and that sometimes we have to walk through the darkest nights and the coldest storms before we can find the warmth and light and love that's been waiting for us all along. So if you enjoyed this tale of Lyra and Eric, of a songbird who learned to sing again, and a king who waited through prophetic dreams for the mate destiny had chosen for him, then I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what resonated with you, or what moments made your heart race, or whether you believed in the power of fated mates and magical voices. And please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about werewolves and alphas and the kind of love that transcends time and space and every obstacle the world throws in its path. Because there are so many more tales to tell about rejected mates who find their true homes, about powers that seem like curses but are actually blessings, about the magic that happens when two souls recognize each other across impossible distances and refuse to let anything keep them apart. And I promise you that every story will be worth the journey. Every character will capture your heart, and every ending will remind you that no matter how dark the night gets, dawn is always coming for those brave enough to keep walking through the storm.